Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Well, this session promises to be extremely interesting, not least because of the challenge that every professional sport faces in preserving its integrity in the eyes of the public and the paying fans. Sports and Racing Integrity Under the Microscope is its official title. We have as always, very eminent panelists, experts in their field to give presentations and some analysis afterwards. But to introduce the session, our opening speaker is the chairman of the Korea Racing Authority. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Kim Nak Soon.
Good morning. 우리 산업의 지속 가능한 성장을 위해서는 공정성이 가장 중요시되어야 된다고 생각을 합니다. 공정성이라 함은 경매를 시행하는 측이 아니라 고객이 공정하다고 판단할 수준이어야 하고, 이는 우리를 불법 사행사업자와 구분하는 주요한 속도입니다. 한국마사회는 현재까지 어디에 내놓아도 손색이 없을 정도로 공정한 관리를 하고 있지만 항상 긴장의 끈을 놓지 않고 있습니다. 최근 한국의 다른 스포츠 종목, 축구, 야구, 심지어 이 스포츠에서도 안타깝게도 승부 조작 같은 사건이 있었습니다. 경마도 예외는 아니고 내기가 있는 한, 특히 해외 경기에 내기를 하는 시대인 요즘 경마 시행차는 공정관리에 대한 더욱 더 큰 책임이 있다고 하겠습니다. 한국마사회는 심판과 공정관리팀이 약물검사, 경주배당 모니터링, 특이사항에 대한 조사 등 공정성이 유지될 수 있도록 정교한 관리를 하고 있습니다. 경마 시행이 법 체계로 관리되는 한국의 경우 비의행의 시 관련 형법 위반으로 다스려지고 있습니다. 한국 마사회장인 제가 공정 세션 좌장을 맡았다는 것은 어떠한 비의행의도 좌시하지 않고 공정성에 있어서 최고 품질의 경마 상품을 구현하겠다는 것, 그리고 이를 통해 한국을 세계 최고의 경마 강국 리스트에 올려놓겠다는 강한 의지로 해석해 주셨으면 감사하겠습니다. 예방이 치료보다 낫다는 얘기는 잘 알고 계실 겁니다. 국가 간 배팅이 이루어지고 있는 국제화 시대에 훌륭한 연사를 모시고 여러 관계자들과 정보를 공유하여 우리 경마 산업의 존립을 위협하는 공동의 적인 비위 척결을 위해 의미 있는 세션이 되기를 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
So we have two presentations for this session, and the first is going to be delivered by Professor Jack Anderson, who is Professor and Director of Sports Law at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Recent and current integrity issues in world sport. Professor? Thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, first of all, for the opportunity to speak here today. Thanks in particular to the ARC Secretariat and also to the Korean Racing Authority for the invite. And thanks to you for listening to this presentation. My job is to present integrity issues as they apply throughout sport worldwide. As part of my role, I give integrity seminars to many of the leading sports bodies worldwide, FIFA, and I've advised Interpol and other agencies on this. But I do want to say one thing, is that I grew up in Ireland, you may have guessed, near a racing track. So I do understand and follow racing closely. And I want to pick up 2 points on that. First of all, it's almost like a personal issue. my first, if you like, engagement with racing was as a 12-year-old in 1986, where I got a bet on at 9-4 on this horse called Dawn Run to win a Cheltenham Gold Cup. So I have an emotive interest in that. I still remember Peter O'Sullivan's famous commentary about the race. But also I have a professional interest in racing, because when I give these integrity seminars, I speak to racing. Racing has a long history, centuries, in dealing with integrity matters. Now, it's had to have that, but its good practice can inform sports globally. And I want to speak about that today. So there's two kind of issues going on there. There's that personal issue, and there's also that professional thing that I want to speak about. And I often start these presentations with, just trying to get on to the next slide there. A quote from a famous Australian jockey, Scobie Breezy, who wasn't mentioned yesterday as one of the famous jockeys, but I'll forgive the ARC chair for that. He went on to be a trainer, won a number of races. After one of his horses won a race, his wife was asked, did Scobie have a bet? Oh no, she said, Scobie hasn't had a bet since he stopped riding. And the reason I pick up on that is I want to pick up on what we say on paper about integrity and the enforcement reality of it. That's really what I want to pick up on. But I also want to pick up on inside information. Inside information is the key integrity issue. What you have now in sport, not just in racing, but sport globally, is a massive stock exchange of sports betting. The key offense in stock exchange regulation is insider trading that can manipulate share prices. Insider information can manipulate betting markets, and that's your key integrity threat. And that's just something I want to keep in mind, and I'll return to time and time again about this integrity threat. And when we talk about integrity, what exactly are we talking about? Not just the integrity of the sport. Let's be honest, we're talking about the integrity of the brand. So yesterday and today, we heard a lot about the global branding of racing. Fantastic. I hope it works. We heard a lot about attracting a certain demographic and getting them to spend a lot on the race course. Fantastic. But remember, if your product is defective, if your event lacks integrity, spectators won't come, sponsors won't sponsor it, TV companies will fade away. Okay? What we want in sport, within reason, is that it is unpredictable. That in some way the outsider will win. That Leicester will win an FA Premiership. That the Philadelphia Eagles will win the Super Bowl. That's why we keep being interested in it. If you mess with that, you mess with the very fundamentals and viability of your sport. And that's the important point when it comes to integrity. And don't think that you're immune from it. I can give you examples. For example, with the Indian Premier League, which is in cricket, which is one of the most valuable sports brands in the world. In 2010, that brand was valued at $5 billion US. After 3 years of corruption allegations and match fixing, it had fallen to 2.9 billion. That is the price of corruption and lack of integrity. And that's why racing has invested heavily and rightly in protecting its integrity. So they're the kind of general points that I want to make up in this. Because one of the things that I picked up yesterday in particular is that racing is dealing with a crowded, competitive sporting market. In Australia, it's competing with that strange footy brand that they have. It's competing with cricket when they're not cheating. Okay, it's competing with various other sporting events. And what I've noticed very much with racing, and as someone who follows racing, is that you are gone into windows, carnivals, festivals. your spot in the diary. And it's vitally important to the commercial viability of the sport that there are no integrity issues surrounding that. So that's an important point. It is a competitive market, and I want to kind of flag that point up. Okay, just going more broadly, I was involved in a major European Union survey on football, proper football, soccer to certain people, but football. And we surveyed athletes around the European Union, 600 in total. 12%, 1 in 8, said they had participated in a fixed event. It's an extraordinary number. 15% had been asked to fix a match within the last 12 months. And the two final figures are the more important ones. We talk about integrity as if it's an external threat, that there are criminal syndicates somewhere in Eastern Europe or some jurisdiction where betting is unregulated targeting our sport. Actually, the threat is from within. 40% of those surveyed said it was club officials who were most likely to approach them. And the final figure, which I think is interesting, is on the reporting. We have regulations which say that those involved in our sport have a duty to report. It's all very well. Do they trust the confidential process, the whistleblowing process that surrounds that? And a third of those surveyed said they wouldn't report, that they would take the hit on an offence of not reporting. And why is that? And how do we respond in racing to that? So that's an interesting angle to that survey, which applies to all sports. The picture here is of a footballer, Joey Barton, who's an English footballer. I was going to say he's a bit of a clown, but I don't know how that translates really, but he is. And he was caught for various betting offences and banned for a considerable period of time. But he spoke very interestingly about player education, about jockey education, about educating those who are involved in sport. And he said 2 points. A, it's not effective. They give us an online course. They expect us to complete it. We flick through it as quick as we can. The second point, he said, is when I go to player education seminars, some of which I presented, I go in my sponsored kit, sponsored by a betting company. Is there a conflict of interest there? So it was an interesting perspective on what he said in terms of player education. Now I have a video, I'm not going to actually play it, but I also have a video there of a player deliberately getting a yellow card in football, which just shows you the exotic betting. Okay? So here is a player in the FA Cup deliberately getting a yellow card at certain periods within the game and betting accordingly through friends.
It's been a long time coming, that yellow card for Wood. He's put in some heavy challenges, some good.
He's put in some heavy challenges because he's on a betting fix. So it just shows you the examples. Okay, that's enough of that video. Thanks very much.
And Woodyard's control the ball on the ground. Again, they're trying to wind up Barton, and Hawkridge has gone down holding his face.
So that just shows you the threat, even at the very sophisticated level of top-level English football, the threat from match fixing. The second sport I want to talk about is tennis, which has just undergone a major integrity review, which took about 3 years and cost about 20 million. I could have done it for less, but we'll leave it at that. And it's an integrity review that surveyed over 3,000 tennis professionals. 15% had knowledge of a fixed event. Tennis is near the top when it comes to match fixing. And it knows that. Its problems are at the non-elite level. There are 15,000 registered male and female tennis players. At most, 500 make any money. 14,500 make very, very little. And it's those players who are approached on the futures and challenger tours to fix events. And it's a very straightforward fix in tennis. You agree to throw the first set. And as a player, you can control that and then bet accordingly. One of the problems they found in tennis was that they sold betting data. In 2012, they did a deal with a company and sold betting data. The more betting data that was available, the more volumes of betting, the more corruption that arose. That's their view. The company in question, Sports Radar, denies that that is the case, but that was the tennis integrity finding. And also, tennis has an integrity unit. And that integrity unit was found to have problems. Not just in terms of resources, but in terms of personnel. What tennis did, and other sports have done this, and if there are ex-police officers in the audience, I apologize immediately, but there are too many ex-police on integrity units. That it needs a blended approach of betting data analysts, of accountants, of people who can read the game and know the sport in question. And that's what the tennis integrity unit is going to bring on. And I think this is an important point when it comes to racing, because you can have all the fancy technology, hearings, appeals, etc. The key to integrity is racing control, and the key to integrity in racing are the stewards. Okay, and that's an important point that we might come back to and have learned from tennis. The video I'm going to show is of a young Australian tennis player called Oliver Anderson. Talented, up and coming, approached by fixers through a game, and his career is virtually over. He was in some ways groomed for this. And the video is self-explanatory. So what you're seeing is a fix in action. And you can see he deliberately lost the first set, easily won the rest. Okay, and that's okay with the video then. So it just shows an example of what tennis is facing. And that draws us then to more general, if you like, points when we're dealing with integrity issues generally. And it's inside information and player education which is key. Educating players, educating jockeys, that they are a key source. And it's a very simple premise. There is a demand out there for illegal betting approaches. There is a demand among certain criminal syndicates for fixing events, sports events. But how do you stop the supply? They need the players, the jockeys, to facilitate the fix. If you educate them and protect them, you cut off the supply. So it's a very important point. One of the points that we found very difficult, and we can explain this in racing terms as well, but particularly in football and soccer, third-party influence. Very poor in football at regulating agents. Very difficult. And we have seen problems with agents approaching players, so something to look out for. Episodic games like tennis and snooker have problems, and of course, what initially was the most corrupt sport of all, and the sport I like, professional boxing, because the people in question can control the event. But what I want to also say is that what we have found in sports like football and tennis is that the corruption and the approaches can move beyond the individual participants. It can also target umpires. Tennis umpires have been targeted. What the fixers found out was that every tennis umpire must enter the result point by point on an iPad. Some umpires were deliberately delaying the entry of points, informing the fixers, placing the bet, then entering the point. So they could manipulate the betting markets. And tennis has had to do something about that. We've also seen examples in football where referees have been approached. So that's a kind of an interesting point generally on that. Now, there's all sorts of solutions out there in terms of dealing with match fixing. They are resource intensive. Okay, best practice in Australia and the UK, which you'll hear about, is where the sports body works with regulated betting companies to get information and also works with the police and possibly the criminal authorities. They're the ideal models, but they're extremely resource intensive. Many sports are on their own. And that's why I think it's very good when you hear in a second about best practice from Australia racing. And it's important to share that because in some ways relying on the state authorities will leave you nowhere. And I'll give you an example. I come from Ireland and our betting legislation, and we're a fairly sophisticated betting market, our betting legislation dates back to the 1930s. We don't have these things as a national integrity unit or anything like that. If the police want to follow sports corruption, they have to rely on old 19th century acts. And there's one example. So sport has to help itself and racing has to help itself. And that's an important point on that. I just want to go on then to 2 or 3 points just to kind of bring everything together. And I want to talk about sanctions. I sit on the Court of Arbitration for Sport and deal with some match-fixing cases. I want to talk a little bit about issues that have come up in match-fixing cases, which can apply to race-rigging cases as well. One of the things that we have found is that more and more sports bodies are relying on evidence from commercial operators who flag up unusual betting patterns. And that's part of the evidence. And there are certain companies that do that. Now, increasingly, the question's been asked by lawyers, by people sitting in arbitrations, is what's the algorithm being used? What's your definition of an unusual betting pattern? Where do you draw the red line? So it's an interesting point as regards to betting data. And the second thing that's coming up is the length of sanction. First-time offences, life bans for first-time offences have been rejected by the Court of Arbitration for Sport as being disproportionate. And how do you make bans more proportionate? And what we're trying to encourage sports more and more to do is come with suspended type sentences where the person in question is put on license, if you like, for a certain period of time. Okay. There's also criminal offences in certain jurisdictions like Australia, and we're going to hear a little bit about that. But I want to keep in mind something that has developed, and it's come up in Australia, but in other jurisdictions as well, and it really does apply in racing. Where you have an integrity investigation, and the integrity investigation reveals, let's say, large-scale doping or match fixing, well then, what position is the winner of that race? Is the horse that came second or third reinstated as first? What position do the trainers and owners have in terms of civil compensation for their loss? Now, it's something we've had to deal with in doping, where certain athletes are beginning to sue for the loss of income. And it's something that has been highlighted in racing as well, and it's one to watch, where a wealthy owner, denied by an integrity issue, may seek civil compensation. So it's something just to watch out for, possibly in the future. I'm not going to speak too much on the criminal sanctions because we kind of speak about those in a second in the follow-up. But I do want to kind of place match fixing in its general context. And there is this feeling out there that, oh, match fixing or race rigging, that's just racing. That's just bookies losing a few bob. So what? It's an internal thing. they'll make it on the next race. Well, actually, it's not. It's more than that. Because remember, a fix on the bookies, a fix in a race is a fix on every consumer who has contributed to that pot or pool of betting. So there's a big consumer issue there as well. The second issue, apart from that small thing about match fixing, that micro, if you like, is the macro level. Okay? And this is something that the UN and Interpol actually have become interested in, and racing is part of their interest. It's where gambling is being used for transnational economic crime, where criminal syndicates are laundering money online from one jurisdiction on a racing event in a second jurisdiction and collecting their winnings in a third jurisdiction. For criminal syndicates, this is a beautiful arrangement because the money from their illicit criminal gains can be laundered and bet on an event that they've already fixed. Okay? And when I give this talk, people say that's not happening. Well, it is. And here are two statistics to show you. The first one is that the winnings on fixed matches worldwide, and this is a research done by Sport Accord in 2013, is 6 times more than the total global trade in illegal sports arms. And Sorbonne has said that organized crime launders per year 100 billion euro on sport. The very basic premise is in the graphic that you see on the right. And on the right of that graphic could be your sport. That's the problem. Okay? Now, personally, I have a slight problem with some of the figures in the Sport Accord in Sorbonne. And the reason I have is because they make some estimates about illegal gambling in jurisdictions where betting is technically illegal. And I think that's an important point. We don't really know the extent of this shadow market or illegal market. Okay, we can guess, but we don't really know. So it's an important point of research going on in the future. And what is the future then? Just a few issues to bring up. First of all, it goes back to my integrity point. Where I grew up, we were very interested in greyhounds. And greyhound was a particularly strong sport. The last greyhound track is closing in Asia this year. How many greyhound tracks are now located in this once the center of the sport, London? Well, that's the last one. That's going to be redeveloped soon. Not as a greyhound track. And why did it fade from the mainstream? Okay, I just want to plant that point for you in a second. If you think you're immune from the threat of integrity, you're not. Okay, and racing is well aware of that, and that's why it's invested heavily. But future issues include the breadth of jurisdiction. When you are launching an integrity investigation, for some jurisdictions, everyone involved is involved in racing and is on a contract basis, so it's easier. But for most jurisdictions, your jurisdiction over people outside of the immediate people involved, the jockey or the trainer, is not that good and may be challenged in court. So it's an interesting point about your jurisdiction over those you seek to discipline. The second point that's come up is the depth of your jurisdiction. With racing integrity in particular, you know, people, you have all sorts of agreements with jockeys or all sorts of agreements with those in your trade about accessing phone records or financial records. What we've seen worldwide from players' associations is a pushback on that for privacy and data protection reasons. So that depth of jurisdiction is going to be challenged. We also have a wider definition of integrity. And that wider definition obviously in racing includes doping as well. But one point that I want to pick up on, and it was a point made by Bernard Salt right at the very beginning. You racing want to expand, and I certainly hope it does. The demographic that you are trying to bring are increasingly middle class and urbanized. And middle class and urbanized people are extremely sensitive on animal welfare issues. So whatever about trying to attract people to a racetrack to get them to bet money or lose money, if they see that there is a lack of integrity when it comes to animal welfare, you will struggle to attract them. And that's again why racing is acutely aware of that integrity issue. The fourth issue is the expansion. Anytime you expand into new events, it brings integrity threats. But just to wrap up in the 2 or 3 minutes that I've left, just some future issues. Yesterday, there was a US Supreme Court decision which liberalized gambling in the US. From Monday, each of the 50 states can offer sports betting so long as they have the legislative framework in place. That will change the gambling industry. Last year alone, Nevada, in terms of profit and revenue, had something like $500 million. The illegal betting market in the US last year was worth $200 billion US. From Monday, it's legal. And remember the technology that the US companies, and it's interesting, US gambling companies, their share price has gone up. You should have been on. Okay, they've gone up already because the technology they will bring will be huge. And also, what are US sports good at? They're very good at marketing. And your gambling, sports gambling experience is going to become more and more immersive. Your jockeys are going to have to learn, as we saw yesterday, to play that piano, to market that event. Okay? Good luck trying to get the Irish jockeys to play a piano. But that is a huge, huge thing. And how that's going to be regulated is going to affect gambling globally. Obviously, there are technology issues. There's the currency issues, which we're going to talk about tomorrow when it comes to things like Bitcoin and virtual currencies and how you trace that. But the last point that I want to make is a very important point. And it comes from someone who loves the sport of racing, but has seen other sports decline. Nothing corrodes quicker than the whiff of corruption. Do you believe in the Tour de France? Do you believe in leading athletics world records? Okay, is that unfair of me to ask that? But nothing corrodes quicker. And what I want to say is, if we were here 50 years ago, in the late 60s, we would all know who the world heavyweight champion in boxing was. Muhammad Ali. Who's the current world heavyweight champion? Well, take your pick. There's about 3, 4 maybe. Why has that sport declined from the mainstream? Why has that iconic, probably one of the most iconic sports photos in the world, why did that signal the decline of the sport? And you know why? Because that picture is a picture of a fixed fight. The fight was fixed. And when you look at that, you see, therefore, the impact of corruption and the pervasive, insidious impact that can have. And that's why integrity is your #1 priority. Thanks very much.
Very interesting, Professor. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker has been a licensed trainer for over 10 years, as well as a breeder, an owner, and a horse rider, apart from everything else. He is also a Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria, Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Forrest will speak to us about global racing integrity issues and the response of regulators. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. I wish to thank the Asian Racing Federation and the Korean Racing Authority for their hospitality and kind invitation to speak to you all today. As the last session comprehensively demonstrated, prosperity of international racing depends to a very large extent on its gambling revenues. If racehorses do not compete on a level playing field, then public confidence dissipates and betting revenue inevitably declines, presumably to the benefit of other forms of gambling. But it is not only betting that suffers. Reputational damage affects the racetrack, attendances, breeding, selling and owning of racehorses. These are all potentially stifled by dishonourable conduct in breach of the rules. Accordingly, it is critical that racing integrity organisations and stewards not only operate effectively within the industry, but equally as importantly, be seen by the public at large to do so. Unfortunately, after the events of the last 4 years, I fear that most Australians with a passing or no interest in racing would be of the view that racing is not conducted fairly and drug cheating is rife. The headlines, which I will now show, demonstrate the problem. In 2015, there were a series of cases involving alleged cobalt administration to horses prior to a race to improve their performance. It made regular and constant news. Throughout that year, and you only need to get a flavour of those headlines to understand why public confidence was affected. In late 2017, when we thought the cobalt storm had passed, this happened. The big fix allegedly involved a number of top-ups by trainers with TCO2, that is sodium bicarbonate, shortly prior to a race. And I'm going to return to its specifics later. The end result is that I suspect the general public in Australia sadly regards racing integrity as an oxymoron and associates the integrity of racing not with the 99% plus percentage of negative drug results in 2017, as both these examples from Victoria and Queensland demonstrate, but with the various slides we've just seen. So what can be done? To pick up on the theme of this conference, I have to advise that integrity is not fun. It is essential, as it underpins the confidence in the sport, which in turn leads to a greater participation and hopefully fun. Now, the first thing that one has to recognise, and as Jack Anderson has spoken to, is that racing integrity bodies throughout the world alert to these issues, as Mr. Kim's opening remarks indicated. But the motive to gain an unfair advantage in a horse race has always existed. And over decades, if not centuries, racing authorities have endeavoured to meet these challenges with many innovative techniques, ranging from intensive drug testing to sophisticated betting monitoring. But the reality that we have to face is this does not seem to have been enough. In this presentation, I propose to mention 4 diverse aspects of racing integrity, focusing on drug infringements. Now, these are the aspects that I wish to discuss briefly with you. One is a novel matter, and that is, should integrity effectively be removed from the control of the controlling body? The second is, how tough do our drug rules need to be? The third is, how do we improve the disciplinary hearings that our Australian experience has demonstrated cause undue and lengthy disruptions to racing? And finally, how does match-fixing criminal legislation affect racing misconduct? Now, the first question is relatively novel. It is whether the integrity operations of a particular racing code should remain within the controlling body or be managed by a separate organisation. Traditionally, racing integrity management, historically provided by racing stewards, has been part and parcel of the operations of the controlling body, where the commercial, welfare and integrity arms operate jointly and usually in the same building. However, over the past 15 years, and more particularly in Queensland in 2016, racing integrity component was removed from the controlling body and is now housed and managed in a standalone organisation. In those states, the structure is involved, as you can see from this slide, with a combination of 3 codes and integrity managed by a totally standalone organisation. The perceived benefits are set out on this slide. In particular, it is said that this form of separation of power and separation of function is intended to provide for the retention of public confidence. But in my opinion, the split system has real disadvantages. Firstly, there's no real evidence that I've seen that a split is necessary. It isolates integrity from the day-to-day racing operations, and invariably it seems that the integrity officers, often ex-policemen with great investigative expertise, but lacking in racing expertise. There's also a lack of expertise when one goes to a tri-code model because there will be a blending of the 3 codes. The costs are significant and have to be borne by the industry, and invariably this type of organisation is established and regulated by government. Whilst I accept that there's a need for racing, for there to be a solid and transparent separation between racing's commercial and integrity operations, that does not mean a standalone body is the answer. On integrity issues, the integrity body must control its own affairs within the current controlling body structure, and most importantly, have the determinate and final say on integrity decisions. Importantly, it cannot be obliged to disclose sensitive operational matters to persons outside integrity, nor can the board or senior management of the controlling body, unconnected with integrity, dictate the decisions. But provided there are proper and transparent structures and good governance within the controlling body and its commercial arm, then this, I am sure, is the preferred response. Now, the second topic that I wish to talk about is that of drug penalties, and particularly those involving the use of performance-enhancing drugs. There is a common theme in all racing jurisdictions that a horse which races with a prohibited substance, performance-enhancing or otherwise, will be disqualified. Equally so, in most jurisdictions, the person responsible for the horse will be liable for a penalty. But how and in what circumstances those penalties will be imposed is subject to a multitude of variations, both in terms of the rules and their enforcement. As you can see on this slide, which sets out the Australian position, and on the next slide, which sets out the position in the UK and in California, there are diverse approaches. In the UK, there is what is said to be strict liability, but then there is a proviso, and the proviso is effectively has the trainer taken all reasonable precautions. In California, there is a matrix set up under the rules in terms of drug offence violations, which is adjusted by reason of mitigating and aggravating factors. I'm sure that a number of you here will have a greater awareness of the types of penalties that are imposed in your own jurisdictions or those with which you're familiar. I think it can be readily accepted that not all findings of a prohibited substance should result in automatic disqualification of a trainer. The positive may have been the result of a long-term treatment which remained in the system unknown to the trainer, may be the result of an unauthorised administration by a stable employee, may be the result of a prohibited substance within the feed or supplement unknown to the trainer, or it may be the result of administration of an innocuous or totally therapeutic drug. So there has to be allowance for that type of situation within the rules. But it seems to me that where the position is that potentially performance-enhancing substance has been given to a horse, then the consequences in terms of general and specific deterrence far outweigh any other consideration and must result in unequivocal stringent penalties. This is the approach taken in a complicated way by WADA, and I suggest that racing must do the same. In such circumstances, I think there should be one rule with an absolute liability and no proviso. The penalty should then be dependent on the type of drug and any mitigating or aggravating circumstances. Where a performance-enhancing drug is involved, then I have been forced to the conclusion, with the events of the last 4 or 5 years, that a mandatory minimum penalty, which judicial officers such as I was invariably hate, I am convinced that that is the only way in which these type of offences can be dealt with. Alternatively, there should be a recommended range of penalties which can be utilised by the tribunal determining the case. I'm emphatic that disqualification has to be a minimal penalty for performance-enhancing drugs, and in my view, disqualification penalties should be measured in years and not months. Now, that all sounds draconian, but the experience that we've had over the last 5 years has driven me to this conclusion. I'm fortified by the fact that it's consistent with what happens in other sports, where a positive usually means a disqualification measured in years, not months. But it should not be thought that such rule changes will be greeted enthusiastically. Only in England could a rule change be said to be liable to provoke a mutiny. The next topic I wanted to talk about is the scourge that we've experienced in Victoria in terms of image of racing and the cost to the industry in multiple hearings of charges against trainers and those connected with alleged administration of drugs. Now, I want you to look at these 2 slides, if you would, and look at the dates. This was the first time, or round about the first time, the cobalt reared its head in the media. 3 years passed, and during all that time, the cobalt issue raged in Victoria. The end result was that the 2 trainers involved, were cleared of administration charges. A rogue veterinarian was held to have been responsible for the administration. But the reality is that it took 3 years to get to that point. Only 2 weeks ago, the question of costs was resolved. And as you can see from the byline, it looks as though the lawyers haven't finished their job yet. In Australia, in most states, there are bodies that hear the charge, and then there is an appeal to other bodies. In Victoria and Queensland, it is to an administrative tribunal, and New South Wales to 2 panels. In the UK, there are 2 appointed panels by the British Horse Racing Authority. In Hong Kong, an appeal to an appeal panel. And in California, there is an administrative review. Now, the review or appellate process, I know from first-hand experience, produces incredible pressure on those involved, both in prosecution and defence, and can be extremely expensive, as anyone here who's paid a QC or an SC will know, and I know from my past life, and at times it can be enjoyable. Not only is this process extraordinarily wasteful and protracted, but some administrative tribunals may well be completely ignorant of racing practices and less well qualified in terms of both legal training and equine knowledge than those who sat on the original decision. At least in the United Kingdom and New South Wales, appeals lie to 1 or 2 appellate bodies with specialist racing knowledge. The common law, whose principles govern a number of the racing jurisdictions represented here, does not require there be multiple hearings nor multiple appeal rights. What it does require is that the one hearing into guilt and penalty be procedurally fair and be heard by an impartial body free from any outside influence, especially that of the controlling body. It is all to the better if the government arms such a body with subpoena and contempt powers. Whilst there must be a right to challenge, but that should only be to decisions on the basis of an error of law, not a delayed and protracted regurgitation of the facts, with new case theories flourishing like flowers in the desert after a rainstorm, circumscribed only by the imagination of the lawyers, and which I doubt can be circumscribed. Such a body, as I have described, can rapidly dispose of all but the most demanding cases within weeks of the charges being laid, and in doing so, the reputational damage and cost is minimised, provided is a fair and independent hearing. Now, a good example of this process is that of the TCO2 cases that I referred to earlier. Notwithstanding that there were 8 persons charged with over 250 counts involving alleged unscrupulous conduct, the hearing before an independent tribunal occurred only 3 months after the charges had been laid in January of this year. The decision on guilt was handed down last Tuesday and the penalties last Thursday. Now here is what happened on liability.
Also tonight, a dark day for racing.
We're very serious about integrity in racing.
8 people guilty of doping in one of the sport's worst scandals. 5 racehorse trainers and 3 stable hands were today found guilty of doping horses and are facing potentially career-ending bans. Altogether, they were charged with more than 270 offences spanning 7 years. Victoria's Racing Appeals and Disciplinary Board has described it as one of the biggest scandals in Australian racing history. Helen Vines reports.
It's a scandal that's dogged racing since last spring carnival, leaving racing authorities and fans aghast.
On the whole, disgusted by the activity, and it was really undermining the sport they love.
The scandal involved 5 trainers, including Robert Smurden and Tony Vazel, along with 3 stable hands linked to the Aquanita stable. The Victorian Racing Appeals and Disciplinary Board said it was a long-running systematic conspiracy to obtain an unfair advantage in well over 100 races over 7 years. Between 2010 and 2017, sodium carbonate and tricarbonate was used to dope racehorses to improve their performance. It was a litany of brazen attempts to cheat over many years by a well-organised team. The scam was uncovered when surveillance cameras were installed in stables, catching one of the accused doping a horse. The scheme came crashing down when another accused blew the whistle on the so-called top-ups, conceding they were not food and water after all.
We spend a huge amount of resources and time in our integrity department, nearly $9 million last year. And the idea of that is to seek out people who are breaching the rules, ensure that the sport of racing is fair.
The accused have all been found guilty of dishonest, corrupt, fraudulent, improper or dishonourable practice in what the board said was one of the darkest and longest chapters in the history of Australian turf.
Good day for racing. It shows that if you want to do the wrong thing, if you are determined to breach the rules of racing, you will be caught.
The penalties will be handed down on Thursday. Helen Vines, ABC News, Melbourne.
Now, here is what happened on Thursday. Number of the trainers, one of the trainers received a life ban. 2 of the other people involved in the administration of the alleged administration of the TCO2 received life bans, and other trainers and those involved were disqualified for periods ranging from 1 year to 4 years. And this is how the press reacted to it. There are 2 points that I think arise out of this. The first is that the hearings were conducted rapidly and the damage to racing was minimised by the fact that there was a short time span between the laying of the charges and the hearing of the charges. No doubt racing's image was substantially affected by it. But the second point, I think, is more pleasing, and that is that, as the Minister acknowledged in the last interview, it was racing investigation that uncovered, I should say, the plot and the plan, and ultimately led to the laying of the charges. Now, under the current system, those who have been found guilty have a right of appeal against both conviction and penalty to an administrative tribunal. If they exercise that right, that appeal will be heard at some indeterminate time in the future by someone who may well have no experience in racing. As an aside, I mention a couple of issues that will have to be grappled with over the next few months, and are mentioned in the clippings we saw. Should the horses which were topped up be disqualified, despite the fact that none have been proved to have raced with an unlawful level of TCO2? Secondly, if they are disqualified, do the owners have a legal claim against the trainer, as Professor Jack Anderson just mentioned? Now, the final topic that I wish to mention is that of the effect of match-fixing legislation on the function of racing integrity groups. Match-fixing legislation, as Jack adverted to, is now enforced in a number of countries where there are major horse racing industries. The question is, does it hinder or help the work of integrity bodies? And the answer that I have to give is a typical lawyer's answer, yes and no. Whilst much turns on the specifics of the legislation, which is generic to all sports and varies from country to country, speaking generally, a criminal offence is potentially punishable by jail time where an attempt is made to influence the result of a sporting contest. In Australia, it must also be established that there was an intention of achieving a financial gain. So, to use an Australian terms, a boat race, that is a race that is set up or fixed, a ring-in, that is a horse who's substituted for another horse, usually lesser performed than the substitute horse, and a doper to stop a horse would all be caught by the legislation and liable to prosecution and criminal penalties. It is, however, doubtful, at least with the Australian legislation, that it can be used in the case of performance-enhancing drugs. The problem is that it is extremely difficult to show that the unlawful conduct, known the administration of the drug, affected or influenced the result of the race and the betting. So to use the TCO2 case as an example, it would need to be proved that the top-up on race day would, beyond reasonable doubt, have affected the result and that it was linked to betting on the race. In summary, whilst I see a real place for this form of legislation in sports generally, it does provide practical problems. The legislation is primarily focused on sports with poor or no integrity policing. Whilst it may and has been used in blatant racing cases, it has the potential to impede the normal investigation by racing integrity groups of rule breaches. Now, as you'll see, the legislation is generic. It can delay and inhibit the proper investigation by stewards because they will wait for the police to carry out their investigation, or alternatively, the persons they want to speak to will take, to use the American expression, the fifth. So potential culprits may well wait a long time and be able to delay and defer stewards' investigations. To some extent, it may well operate to frustrate the purpose for which it was introduced, namely to get the crooks out of the particular sport. There is no easy answer to this issue. The legislation will not go away, and racing integrity will just have to learn to cope with the inconveniences it may produce. Now, I suspect that this presentation has been somewhat depressing, but I don't want it to produce too much despondency. For my part, I know that all these issues are under active consideration at both a government and industry level in Australia. In racing, what we want to be remembered for are races like this.
He's working into it on the outside, and so is no sky wide out. Then came
could you look at the horse with the green
round
cap, check sleeves and the white blinkers, travelling about 8th? And don't worry about the interference that occurs after.
They bunch up around the turn. Now Fame Game, he's got to the extreme outside with the offer. Big Orange first for home from Excess Knowledge. Snow Sky joining in, and now Trip to Paris is coming. They're followed then by Who Shot the Barman, going for a run on the inside is Our Ivanhoe. Coming past the 300 metres, Excess Knowledge went to the lead narrowly. Here's Prince of Penzance coming on down the outside. Prince of Penzance from Michelle Payne. Now Max Dynamite starts to charge home. Prince of Penzance from Max Dynamite. Prince of Penzance, it's history at Flemington. Michelle Payne. Prince of Penzance beat Max Dynamite.
Now, in the spirit of this conference, that was the first female jockey to win a Melbourne Cup. She then gave the following outstanding interview.
And John Richards and Darren stuck really solid with me. I put in all the effort I could. I galloped him every gallop he had and did everything I could to stay on him because I thought he had what it takes to run a race in the Melbourne Cup. And I just can't say how grateful I am to them, and just want to say to everyone else can get stuff because they think women aren't strong enough, but we just beat the world. And
finally, what we want to see are owners like these, even if their horse is beaten.
Second. You finished. Take that. Who won? Take that. Who won? Take that. Who won? Who won? Take that. Who won? Take it. Second. I don't care. I don't care. This is the Melbourne Cup. I don't care. We came here. We finished second. We would have been happy with last. Yeah. What a run it was by your horse, eh? Hey, that was a great run. Oh. That is a bear hug. Have you done any wrestling? You've had a great party and you've run second in the biggest race we've ever had.
Now, Jack, I'll forgive your remark about Australians cheating. That is a typical Irish response to a horse running second. I hope what I've had to say has been of some use to you all, and I thank you all for your patient attention. Thank you.
Oh, great video again. Okay, gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, you're going to take the lead, so over to you.
우리 잭 브레스트 판사님 고생하셨습니다. 어차피 하시던 길이니까 한 말씀만 더 질문 드리겠습니다. 현재의 경마 공정성을 위협하는 가장 큰 이슈가 무엇이라고 생각하시는지 한번 말씀 좀 해주십시오.
Thank you, Honorable Jack Forrest. Thank you for your sharing your informative experience and knowledge. And what I'd like to ask you is that what do you see the single biggest threat to the integrity of racing?
I think given the context of the presentation I've just made, that it has to be performance-enhancing drugs or drugs generally. The necessity to endeavour to monitor and track down the new range of drugs, everything ranging, as we know, we've heard of cobalt, that had not been heard of 10 years ago. TCO2 we thought had finished, we thought we had the measures in place to stop that. We know that gene doping is coming. We know that, as we'll hear tomorrow, that there are plans to endeavour to thwart that threat. The reality is we have to be, I think, ever vigilant in relation to drugs. That's not to say that there aren't other problems in terms of race fixing and race manipulation. But my concern at the moment is that performance-enhancing drugs, the use of it, affects not only the result, but the perception of the general public. And that is the thing I fear the most.
제가 생각하는 그 경마 공정성에 있어서 가장 중요한 것은 가장 그 심각한 위협은 병주 능력을 향상시키는 약물의 사용이라고 생각합니다. 약 10년 전에는 그 알 수 없었던 코발트라든지 TCO2 그리고 내일 발표될 예정인 그 진 도핑이라든지 이런 식의 문제들이 경주에 대한 공정성을 가장 심각하게 위협하고 있다고 생각을 하고 또 이런 그 새로운 약물의 출현이라든지 이런 거에 대해서 그 모니터에서 사용을 못할 수 있도록 강력한 규제 조치가 이루어져야 된다고 생각을 합니다. 그 이런 약물의 사용으로 인해서 이 경마에 대한 그 인식이 크게 영향받고 있기 때문에 이런 점에 있어서 가장 중요하다고 생각합니다.
계속해서 우리 닥터 잭 앤더슨 교수님 질문 하나 드리겠습니다. 우리가 스포츠의 공정성을 유지하는 데 있어서 왜 점점 더 어려워지고 있는지 어떤 판단을 하고 계신지 좀 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
And I would like to ask you, the Professor Jack Anderson, and nowadays, how much more difficult has it become to preserve the integrity of sport in general?
Thanks very much for your question. First of all, just quickly before I answer that, as someone who had a massive bet on both Max Dynamite and Heartbreak City, I was my reaction was not similar to that, I can tell you. That's the first thing I'll say on that. And the second thing I will say is, I work now at Melbourne Law School. And it's fantastic to work in Melbourne because they give you a day off for the racing, which they don't even give you in Ireland. But one of the things that I notice is that if I say I'm interested in racing, it's dismissed by colleagues and most of the students. And it's dismissed because they feel it's corrupt, or they feel there's animal welfare concerns. And that disappoints me, and because I know the efforts that go into protecting the integrity of it. But that just shows you the problem with the whiff of corruption or the lack of integrity. And the second issue that I want to pick up on, and we saw, for example, the Cobalt case, is that, ironically, with many sports, and racing is an example, the threat comes from within. It is people whose livelihoods are dependent on the sport are often the ones who undermine the integrity of that sport. It's a small percentage, but that's the percentage we have to look out for because it's vital for the future of the sport.
네, 우선 답변을 드리기 전에 제가 멜번에서 이 경마와 관련된 종사하는 것은 매우 영광스럽게 생각하고, 그 경마 공정성은 그 사회적 부패와도 연결이 있기 때문에 매우 중요하다고 판단하고 있습니다. 그리고 두 번째로, 그 사람들의 일상에 있어서 스포츠는 매우 중요한 포션을 차지하고 있기 때문에 그 아주 작은 포션의 사람들이 그 우리 미래를 미래와도 연관되어 있는 스포츠에 있어서 일으키는 그 부정 행위 때문에 많은 이미지와 그리고 스포츠 발전에 저해되는 거에 대해서는 그 매우 관리가 어렵고 이에 대해서 철저한 예방이 필요하다고 생각합니다.
예, 고맙습니다. 아주 성의 있는 발표를 해주시고 또 답변을 해주시고 감사드립니다. 계속해서 우리 사회자가 진행하실까요?
And thank you very much for your answer. And I'd like to pass the lead to the Adnan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Song Ho, thank you very much. Jack Forrest, both called Jack, so I'll have to use your surnames. Just picking up on that point you made about your fear of illegal drugs in racing. At what level do you think these drugs are most prevalent? Because as Professor Jack has said, in tennis, it's the lower echelons where there's more corruption. And that's also the case in many other sports. What do you think about illegal drugs and their prevalence in racing?
I would have liked to have said that it is more prevalent at the lower levels, let's say country race meetings or provincial race meetings. But the experience with the TCO2 cases has driven me to conclude that it can be at a far higher level. A number of those administrations that occurred during the Melbourne Cup Carnival, and in some occasions to horses competing in Group 1 races. I'm forced to the conclusion that people will try anything in any sort of race, anywhere, at any time. And that reinforces the necessity for stringent racing integrity. I don't think one can quarantine it as you might with other sports.
Professor Anderson, to a certain extent, racing is a global leader in terms of fighting corruption, preserving its integrity, because it is so utterly critical. And, you know, when you look at football, it must be more difficult to fix a football match because there's so many players involved. In racing, it's the jockey and the horse, and that's it. So possibly it's maybe easier. But what can other sports learn from the standards that are being set by racing in terms of investigating corruption?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we found interesting, at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, we had a recent case involving a World Cup soccer qualifier between South Africa and Senegal, where the referee was corrupt. And the referee gave penalty kicks to one of the sides at critical periods of time. But what we found out when the evidence was presented to us, there was a lot of evidence about unusual betting patterns. Fine. But the critical point was whether or not the penalty was dubious. Had you experienced people who could read the game and assess the game to see whether... So that's a critical point. And in racing, that's where the stewards come in, and that's where the control of racing is important, because you've almost instantaneous decision making, and it's vital for racing that stewards are protected, supported, and educated in that. And those examples, that example from racing alone, can then feed in to other sports as well, because we've seen it in tennis as well. Players in episodic games like tennis, like snooker, and even in boxing, can take a dive, and it's very difficult to read that. And that's your primary piece of evidence. So there's an example that we can use.
Jack, Forrest, are there any differences in the integrity threats to racing as against other sports?
I think generally they're the same. Jack Anderson would be in a better position to answer than me, but my perception is that they're the same. As the question of fixing races to some extent. That, I think, has passed. I think with the technological sources we now have to examine a race, the old-fashioned pulling a horse up occurs rarely, simply because there's so much video now of a race that it's very difficult to disguise it. It may be that I'm naive in that, but that's certainly my perception of our experience in recent years. So I think we are better placed than other sports in terms of identifying match fixing of that type. On the other hand, as I've said, in terms of drug detection, we need to keep up with other sports. We would hope we're a leader. We have terrific laboratories throughout the world, in France, Hong Kong, Australia, who are at the forefront of scientific research into drugs and performance-enhancing drugs. But we need to be vigilant and carry out the type of research that we're going to hear about tomorrow.
How important is it that law enforcement becomes involved, and when does criminal law become applied to cases of corruption? That video you showed of that big corruption ring and doping and careers suffering, the one on TV there, was criminal law involved there, or was it left to the governing body of racing?
Jack might want to say something about this in a moment, but I'll answer just on a factual basis. The police have not yet, as I understand it, the police have not yet become involved, but at the end of the inquiry, at the end of all the, if there are any appeals, I anticipate at the end of any appeals that the police will then investigate and see whether any charges can be laid. But at the moment, they have not interfered or intervened, and to a large extent, as I follow the situation, that's been beneficial because it's allowed the investigation by the stewards to proceed without there being a threat of persons taking the fifth, the men taking the fifth, or saying, I'm going to wait and see what's going to happen with police charges.
Yeah, but okay, just before, Professor, please come in on this, but Jack, as a racing fan, would you like to see the law become involved? Because punters have been, they've been defrauded.
No, I think most of us who know racing would rather the stewards and the integrity bodies carried it out first. Because, as Jack said, because of their expertise.
Okay, Professor?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways with criminal law, you've got to be careful what you wish for in what you get, because if you get the legal authorities and police involved, and there are parallel investigations with racing and the criminal authorities, that can impact on the value actually of both. And so in some ways you have to be careful with the criminal law's involvement in that sense. The second thing that we have found in Australia is that there have been some prosecutions, including that tennis player I showed, Oliver Anderson, for match-fixing offences. But when they go to court, usually at a magistrate's level, they tend to get very light sentences. And sometimes they only get fined. And there's multi-reasons for this. But one of the reasons that we seem to have found is that courts are of the view that the player is simply a scapegoat for the sins of the sport as a whole, and that the player was the easiest target and filtered into the system. So that's just an interesting point on that. And I would think that your preference would be integrity in the sport itself. yes, criminal law sanctions as a deterrent at the end, but primarily the sport itself.
Okay, but surely then education is extremely important, but then there's the question of the level of punishment. What about the level of punishment in racing? You'd have thought that if immediately you're going to get lifetime bans for certain misdemeanors, that kind of severity of punishment may actually stop people from coming to the authorities and saying, look, I've been approached to do this or this. Is there any sort of guidelines in terms of the terms of punishments for different sorts of illegal activities in racing?
The answer is no. There are disparate penalties handed out. One of the distinguishing factors between, say, disqualifying a trainer and disqualifying, say, a tennis player, let's say a low-level tennis player, is that the trainer has an enormous staff. He employs 50 or 60 people. He or she employs 50 or 60, may employ 50 or 60, if not more people. Each of their livelihoods will be thrown into jeopardy. And it's very hard convincing a tribunal, as we've found, to convince a tribunal to impose large and lengthy penalties where there's going to be chaos in terms of the lives of people who may find it hard to get another job. At the end of the day, I think that's, while a relevant consideration, the deterrent is so important, there has to be heavy penalties.
So you think that there should be penalties despite what you've said, the concerns about other people
I'm afraid
involved?
that's the consequence, because otherwise neither general nor individual deterrence works effectively.
Why hasn't it happened then?
Well, it does and doesn't. The answer is we don't have huge long penalties. In this case that I just showed, there were lifetime bans. But they're unusual. As lots of people here in the room would know. Generally they're for months or years, and more measured in months than years. I think we have to reappraise our approach to penalties, particularly with performance-enhancing drugs.
Professor?
Yeah, one of the things that we've found with sanctioning is, and this comes across in doping as well, people like to say, well, if someone's caught doping, give them a lifetime ban, that'll serve as a deterrent. Actually, the evidence is it doesn't. And second of all, there's a plea bargaining element to it. If you give someone a lifetime ban straight away, they are not going to cooperate with your investigation, and you can lose a lot of intelligence in that. So that's one thing. The second thing that we have found from the criminal courts and the research we've done is one of the reasons the criminal courts do not give lengthy sentences for match fixing is that they are satisfied that a lengthy sport-specific ban is much more effective because it goes to the livelihood of the person in question, and it sends a much more effective and deterrent message to the sports community involved.
Are you surprised, both of you, that international sporting organizations haven't gotten together to create an umbrella body that could possibly be a kind of overseer of international professional sport? Is it too much to ask? Are the interests too disparate? Are they scared of something?
There has been calls to have a World Anti-Corruption Sports Agency along the anti-doping agency lines. I just don't buy that at all. And one of the reasons is when it comes to gambling regulation and it comes to corruption related to gambling, generally across the world we have an opinion that doping is bad for various reasons. But the regulation of gambling worldwide is a patchwork quilt of regulation. So trying to harmonize gambling regulation or match fixing offences on a worldwide basis will simply not work. And I think there will be a level of bureaucracy there that is not needed. What is needed is, and this is why the Asian Racing Conference is good, is to share best practice among the industry itself. That's much more effective than an umbrella body, and that's the lesson actually we're learning from the World Anti-Doping Agency.
Jack, are you happy with where racing is at the moment in terms of its fight against potential corruption and preserving its integrity?
I think I am. I think that, notwithstanding the video that we saw of the top up the TCO2 case, the fact is that was discovered by really good investigation. And but for good investigation and by people experienced in racing. What worries me is that if we go at a heavy-handed approach by and followed the example of splitting integrity away from racing, that is, and having an organisation that stands alone, that then endeavours to run integrity, racing integrity, but from afar with people who don't have the experience, that troubles me. I hope I'm not too pessimistic about that, but I share Jack's view that what is essential is to have a combined approach within an organisation to integrity, provided, as I've said, integrity runs its own race.
Okay, we've just got just over a minute left. Professor, are there any methods in racing that have been put in place to encourage whistleblowing? That could be very important, of course, couldn't it?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult task for everyone in sport with regards to whistleblowing. And actually all whistleblowers in sport have generally been treated very, very badly. Earlier in the year I was involved tangentially with the Russian doping investigation. And the whistleblower in question there is in hiding under witness protection in the United States. And that's just an example of it. But so it's very difficult. And it's, as I said in the presentation, you can have this duty to report and then put that on the people in question. But report to whom, to what, and how is an important point. And that whistleblowing is hugely important for intelligence gathering. And sport hasn't done that very well, unfortunately.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the important break of the day. It is lunchtime. Afterwards, we'll have a session on racing and its place in popular culture. But for the moment, Jack Forrest, Jack Anderson, and Kim Nak Soon, and Sung Ho as well. Thank you very much indeed.